exciting new venture for me at the WEF. I've been moderating sessions here since 1999, and I don't think I've ever moderated one like this. So I have really no idea how it's going to go. I will start by introducing the contributors to the discussion. Then I will go through how we're going to proceed. But the key point is it's going to be very much an exchange with the audience. So we're going to have a couple of questions at the beginning, and there will be a 10-minute exchange between the two panelists, and then you can ask questions. I don't mind in this case if you make a point, but the point will have to be brief. We've got questions coming from a virtual, from an audience out in the world, and we want the panelists to have an opportunity to address those questions. And that means you can't make long speeches. I also think that one of the fascinating things about this is, though the two participants, Christine Lagarde, of course, who is currently president of the European Central Bank, before that was managing director of the IMF, and Michael Sandel, a very distinguished political philosopher, would you say, who's professor of government at Harvard University, at which point everybody says boo. The interesting thing about these two people is they are immensely distinguished, incredibly thoughtful, and which is what makes this much more interesting. We wouldn't regard them as professional economists in the sense that they haven't done graduate degrees in economics. And I, the moderator, have, which is a very interesting situation for me to be in. And the very fact that we're doing this shows that the question is not how to trust economics, but why is economics so damned untrustworthy that we have to have this discussion in which very distinguished people thinking about economics and its role in the world can explain how to make this untrustworthy subject, an untrustworthy system that they have been responsible for creating, work better. And when we get to the discussion, we'll focus on that, and then we'll have an exchange with you. Now, before that, we are going to have some questions, and to address those questions, you have to get onto Slido. And what you have to do is scan this QR code with your smartphone. I'm told you can do it from where you're sitting, and you choose the right room at the top of the screen, and the room is Aula. And you use the WEF hashtag Davos24. I think I've got that more or less, if you need to. And apparently you have to reselect the room on the Slido app if you've used Slido this week. If you pass this really complex exam, you can answer one of the questions. I'll give you, let's say, 30 seconds for this, and then we'll get to the question. Is everybody, well, put up your hands when you're on Slido. Oh, there are some really seriously clever people, obviously young people. A few still struggling?
Yep.
Okay. People are doing well. So how much do you trust our existing economic system? One should take into account, you might want to look at this. These people are at the WEF, and that might tell you a bit about their attitude to the current economic system, and not least for the fact that they're probably doing rather well out of it. At the moment, we've got 48% think they rather trust it, 23% definitely trust, and well, we're getting a little more don't trust, but still the don't trust, that's a pretty fair minority. So you're going to have to persuade them that it's as untrustworthy as you might think it is. At least one of you might. Okay. Have we got those well enough? Can we move on to the next question? Is there another question? Yes? So if you think there's a problem, and of course lots of you think it's perfect, what do you think are the problems with it? Okay, that's interesting. Well, we're just starting. Okay. Are we getting to the end, sort of? Okay. It's still sort of light, settling down a bit. Okay, global inequalities, interesting. Environmental disaster, 15%. Domestic inequalities, 13%. Slow growth, 12%. Lack of jobs, 5%. Now, that's a very interesting set of answers. And it seems to be stabilizing around there. So basically, they trust the system, but to the extent they don't, they seem to worry about global inequality most. That's actually, telling the honest truth, it's not what I'd expected. So that's educational. Now, when at the end of the discussion, we plan to put these questions up again, and we will see if you'll change your minds. We don't strictly have a debating motion, so I won't say at the end of this who won. But maybe the panelists could work it out for themselves. So what we're now going to do is have a discussion on these questions before we go to the floor for you to make questions and comments. I'll tend to take them in groups of 2 or 3, by the way, and try to be as brief as you can. So let me start with the following question. What, in your opinion, is good and bad about economics and the economic system it has created, inspired, or influenced? And then after discussion of that, we will have a discussion of what's to be done about it. So let's start then with Christine. What is good or bad about economics and the economic system that we have?
Well, thank you very much, Martin. I was going to actually preface any comments I make with the fact that I'm not an economist by training and background, but you've taken care of that. So here goes my disclaimer, because I'm a jurist by background and certainly a lawyer by passion, but I had to deal with many, many economists. And for the last 20 years of my life, I had to deal with economics. So it brings me to, asking myself, what is economics really about? And going back to a basic definition, we could argue that it's the allocation of scarce resources, which has been well served question over the last decades by an efficiency aim, which fitted a period of time of free markets, globalization, a good advocate of which is sitting to my left, particularly in the 80s, 90s. And that as a result of that, economics in and of itself could sort things out. And that markets in particular would be perfectly able to achieve that efficiency goal that we had. And in a way, politics, for instance, was a distraction, or politics, if it was actually acting, was promoting, particularly in the advanced economies, in days when we had the North-South dialogue and difficulties, but in advanced economies, certainly politics was promoting these principles. And I'd like to come to 2 points. One thing that I have observed from my vantage point now at the ECB and previously at the IMF, which is that efficiency aim that was there has been gradually replaced over the course of time, and particularly in the last few years, by a security aspiration. So security replacing efficiency. And if I want to take you to 3 examples of that, I would certainly take climate change first, and the climate transition necessity, which is not driven by efficiency, which cannot be sorted out and achieved by market rules and principle only, but require other tools, and I'll come to the tools in a minute. That's the second point I want to make. Second area where security has prevailed over efficiency in terms of goal is energy. And if anything has been learned from the horrible Russian aggression against Ukraine, we've learned that energy is not just a matter of efficiency, it's not just a matter of supply and demand and setting of prices. It can be manipulated to the extreme, and it's certainly a quest for security. The third area which I have, and which is again in debate and possibly under threat, is supply chains, which we had taken for granted, where cost reduction and just on time were the key principles, and where now the just in case and security of supply and safety of the supply chain becomes the aspiration. So with that as a background, and from my very small window in the economic world, which is that of a central bank, and with in mind the first thing that I said at the first town hall that I attended at the ECB, which was to the economists in the room that I didn't know very well at the time, but informed by my IMF days, and I have an IMF colleague in the back of the room who will attest to that, I said, beware of models. And if I bring these two together of, security over efficiency, beware of models, what I draw from that is the fact that many of those shocks that are bringing security over efficiency are exogenous shocks, are certainly not linear development, but are crisis or development or exogenous development that are not in models, that have not been in models, and that have led us, and the ECB, the European Central Bank, was the first one to admit that it had got it wrong in a way, was not captured in our model, and therefore gave us projections and forecast that were out of sync with what we should have actually explored. And that leads me to my last point, which is that economists, not the good ones like you, Martin, but many economists are actually a tribal clique. There have been studies of, quotations, cross-fertilization, cross-references, and economists, I think, together with quantic physicists, are the most tribal scientists that you can think of. They quote each other's. Yeah, men more than women, by the way, but that's another story.
Ooh.
But they don't, it's true.
Yeah.
But they don't go beyond that world because they feel comfortable in that world. And maybe models have something to do with it. And what I think we should move towards, and I'm trying to convince my colleagues that we have to, is bring in people that are not members of the tribe. If we had had more consultation with epidemiologists, if we had had, and we now have, thank goodness, climate change scientists inside to help us with what's coming up, if we were consulting a bit better with geologists, for instance, to properly appreciate where some of the rare earth and resources are out there, I think we would be in a better position to actually understand the developments, project better, and be better economists. So there.
That's very, very interesting. I should say that myself, having been an academic economist and having a terrible tendency to quote political scientists and political philosophers, I long since ceased to be a respectable economist in fact, I think not even really an economist. So that I am very comfortable with what you said, but I do agree that many of my friends will be pretty shocked. So, Michael, what's good and bad about economics?
Well, let me begin with the question of trust, which is really the centerpiece of this Davos year. If we want really to restore trust in economics, what we have to do is close our eyes and try to forget the follies and the failures of models and of mainstream economic advice over the past 4 decades. If you want to trust economics, you have to try to forget the self-assured promise that we were all given by the proponents of the so-called Washington Consensus of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, that everyone would be better off if we brought about a frictionless system of global capitalism with the outsourcing of jobs to low-wage countries with low labor protections, if we deregulated finance and insisted on the free flow even of short-term capital in and out of countries, we were told, we were assured that this would increase the stability of the financial system. This was before the financial crash of 2008 brought that advice and assurance tumbling down. We would try to forget also the naive assurance we were all given by the defenders of this model that the frictionless finance-driven version of global capitalism would inexorably bring countries of the world toward liberal democracy. That was a part of the model and its claims. And one other thing we'd have to forget or forgive, Martin, and that would be the assurance, the conviction that there was no alternative, that the particular version of finance-driven globalization that was promoted, that was an article of faith by mainstream economists giving advice during that picture, was simply adapting to what was essentially a force of nature. Margaret Thatcher declared again and again, there is no alternative. Bill Clinton said globalization is not something we can hold off or turn off. It's like the equivalent, the economic equivalent of a force of nature like wind or water. And then there was Tony Blair, who said that globalization was as unalterable as the seasons. I hear people say we have to stop and debate globalization. He declared, you might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. Now, it was smug at the time, but in retrospect, it seems quaint. Climate change has reconfigured the seasons. Summer heat is coming sooner and lasting longer. Some scientists tell us that absent changes in the way we live, by the end of the century, summer may last half the year. So the line between the necessary and the possible shifts beneath our feet. And today we find ourselves having to debate and decide whether autumn should follow summer, just as I think we need now to debate and decide by what economic arrangements we want to live.
Okay. I think that given my miserable performance as a moderator here, and the fact that it shouldn't just be an exchange between us, I'm going to, you've had two very clear statements. Both are critical, but differently so. And I would say it's fair to say that the dominant thrust of Christine Lagarde's comment is the agenda has changed, right? And it's changed naturally because the world has changed. And a big problem associated with this, but not the core, I think not really at the core, is economists are arrogant and tribal. I think that's fair. And they really believe in models of the things that cannot be modeled precisely. And they believe they have a knowledge of the world which is actually impossible. I agree with all of that, by the way. And Michael goes in a rather different direction. He basically says, fair enough. I hope this is fair. This was all a terrible mistake. The last 40 years was a terrible mistake. It produced essentially nothing good, or at least you didn't mention anything, maybe because you didn't have much time. We'll have a question later. And we just have to throw this away and have a different way of doing things.
Well,
is that unfair?
It's a little bit unfair.
Oh, okay.
I wouldn't say nothing good, but I will say, and this is provocative enough, that this way of thinking and designing the economy paved the way and bears responsibility for the populist backlash against elites and inequality and social division that we are now facing. I would put it that way, Mark.
Since I've written a book of about 380 pages, which argues the same thing, I can't possibly disagree, can I? So you've had a very good presence of the argument. So now I'm going to go to the floor. I'd like to take about 3 or 4 comments, questions. I hope to remember them all. And say who you are. There is going to be a microphone. I believe. So let's see who wants to ask a question. This lady, please. Could you stand up, perhaps, just so that they can easily find you? Oh, wait a second. Yes. Say who you are, if you would, and
Hi.
question, comment.
Thank you. I'm Danai Kiriakopulu. I am an economist from my sins, currently working at the Bank of England and also a member of the Young Global Leaders of the Forum. So the topic question is how to trust economics, but also we've talked about how to trust economists, and you've touched a little bit on the issue of diversity in economics and the tribalism. And I wanted to ask more about solutions for that, because yes, we've been talking about diversity in central banks, in other economic institutions, and there's been a lot of progress on gender diversity, geographic diversity, but if everyone went to the same economic schools, that's not diversity really. So just wanted to get your thoughts on that, both of you. Thank you.
So you're suggesting particularly that diversity of intellectual diversity is also important, which I strongly agree. This gentleman, who I happen to know a little, say who you are.
Ishwar Prasad from Cornell University, and I died in the Wool Economist. I feel compelled to defend my tribe, but I will instead say that perhaps you're asking too much of my tribe. If you think about what economic models deliver, the good models really deliver powerful insights. They don't really solve all of the world's problems. And I take your point, Christine, that perhaps we take models a little too far when we think that they represent reality. Now, a good economist, to be honest, does not think that the model represents reality. It's an abstraction from reality, and I think it's a useful way to make progress. The difficulty is that once you deal with the messiness of the real world, especially political systems, then things become a little more complicated. The basic principles of economics sometimes get convoluted. Now, I don't stand here and blame political scientists for Trump, and perhaps you shouldn't blame economists for everything that goes wrong in economies. But it's really worth thinking about whether we have thought about economics in the wrong way, rather than providing these basic insights as instead trying to encompass the failures in political systems and social systems as well.
Okay, I'll take one more question. You, sir? Yes. Could you stand up so they can see you? I'll come to you later, promise.
My name is Anirudh Jalan. I run a company called Recycle, where we create a marketplace for plastic waste in India. My question is, if Schumpeter were alive today, and if he would see AI...
If who? Schumpeter, okay.
If he were to witness AI and climate change, do we think that his theory would be a little different?
He would?
Theory would be a little different.
Would be?
Different.
His theory of growth here, he produced quite a lot of theories.
Okay, so that new technological innovation would disrupt existing jobs and existing systems.
And you want to ask whether he would change his, okay. Okay, that's an interesting way to go. I'll come to that in a moment. Could you explain why, just to make clear, I understand why Schumpeter might respond to what's going on now by saying my theory of disruptive growth is wrong? I would have thought it's vindicated, but sorry, I'm not a panelist.
I'm in the energy transition and circular economy space, and he says that any new technological innovation would disrupt existing jobs.
Yeah.
And with AI, but what do we think that in the energy transition or in the climate change transition, would that really disrupt existing? Would it augment it? And the same for AI.
Okay. Disrupt or augment are the alternatives. Okay, I'll come to that in a moment. Okay, let me, if I may, go to the panel, and then I should probably look at my screen. Christine, I think the question about how do we solve the problem of diversity and particularly intellectual tribalism is very well addressed to you, since you're running one of the world's most important central banks. So what are you doing to solve it?
First of all, thank you for the question, because I think that one of the ways to solve it is to bring it up for debate, to be vocal about it, and to recognize that if we do not make progress, we will continue to have this group thinking that doesn't work. When you're surrounded, as some of you have been, or as I have been and still am to an extent, by the same exact kind of character, I will not describe in details, who have gone exactly to the same schools, who are roughly the same age, how do we expect, new thinking or real debate? So to talk about it, to raise your voice and the voice of young participants like the young leaders, but also to have, as much as possible, this principle of diversity endorsed at the highest level, because you have to lead from the top on that one, to have quotas in place, or at least targets, to review them on a regular basis, there are lots of tools that can be used for hiring and selecting and building the pipeline that are used by some, but not by many. And I think that, everyone is accountable. I'm not going to tell you how many women I've hired. It's hard, because then you very quickly get the pushback of the white middle-aged man who says, I'm at a disadvantage, this ain't fair. But as, RBG would have said, to restore parity in the Supreme Court, she was asked, how many Supreme Court justices should there be? And she said, all of them should be women. And when asked, why do you say that? She said, well, to restore parity, you have to look back at history, and it has been those 9 judges, always of the same gender and of the same color for many, many years at least. So it's not retaliation, it's rebalancing. I'm not going as far as that. But we really have to make efforts. And I thank you for your question. And I think that each and every one of us, wherever located, we have to help with that, because it's good for the bottom line. It's good for yourself and feeling good about it. And it's just economic sense and not nonsense.
Can I thank you very much? I was just thinking that if that's the goal that you have, you've got quite a long way to go.
Absolutely, I know.
100% female ECB will take a little while.
I was pushing the envelope on purpose.
Yes, I understand. Now let me... It's what Prasad asked, I think, quite an important question, which is a sort of nasty question economists focus on. So you've asked very important and made very important systemic questions. But this is a way, since we can't debate these for hours, within any economy we could imagine, it's a very complicated system, obviously. We have to make policy decisions about how high should the interest rate be now? What is an efficient tax system? And of course, there are other issues there. Now, economists would say that you can't really get at the problems of complex systems without, because the reality is simply too complex, just methodologically, some degree of reliance on simplifying models. You do have to understand the simplifications, but there's really no way out of this with all the many questions you get asked about what policy should be. And isn't that actually inescapable?
I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is that if we look at the most creative economists working today, they do not rely mainly, or in some cases at all, on simplifying models. What they do, there's a shift, I think, toward more empirical work and work that bears a closer connection to broad questions of social and political philosophy. For example, I think there are many excellent economists doing creative work, in part by not relying on simplified doctrinaire models. Daron Acemoglu, for example, is drawing our attention to whether technology is truly an exogenous, autonomous force, or whether it can be directed as an open political question. Paul Collier is raising the question whether place-based economic development is an essential alternative to a single-minded focus on maximizing aggregate GDP. Ann Case and Angus Deaton have written about deaths of despair, looking at actual data about the vulnerability of those without university degrees to deaths by suicide and drug addiction and alcohol abuse. Raj Chetty has challenged complacent ideas that it's always possible to rise upward mobility from rags to riches by doing detailed empirical work on actual rates of mobility. What distinguished these 5 economists, and they're, I think, among the most fertile, creative economic thinkers working today, is precisely, Martin, that they do not rely primarily on simplified models. They look at the world. They do detailed empirical studies animated by a broader social and political set of questions. That's where I think the hope for restoring trust in economics lies.
Can I bounce back as well and go to the question of diversity? It's also a chance for diversity because models have generally attracted male economists, if only because math is critically important. And it's notorious that young women, particularly, 10, 20 years ago, were not very much in STEMs. Well, empirical work, research, analysis, attention to details, something that women are bloody good at. I would have added Esther Duflo to the list of economists that you've mentioned here. So that's an added tool that we can use.
Yeah. Well, I've cited all of these people in my book, and I'm not going to talk about. I'm not here to defend economics, thank heavens. There was a question.
Our differences seem to be vanishing by the moment, by the minute.
Well, anyway, I'm not going to go into that because I've only got 11 minutes. I knew this would be very, very problematic.
And Schumpeter, we all agree, will have.
The question on, does either of you wish to comment on, or feel that they would like to comment on whether we should take for granted that the innovations we're seeing at the moment are essentially disruptive in the Schumpeterian sense, or should we have? Is he another moribund economist, or actually so outside the current conventional wisdom of economists that we can take his views seriously? What do you think? Is Schumpeter somebody whom you would put, despite his very questionable views on democracy, which you will remember, in Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, right, the first political science book, political philosophy that I've read. Anyway, is he okay? Is he in your little pantheon of economists that are okay?
Yes, in the following respect. I disagree with his particular conception of democracy. It's too narrow. It lacks adequate sense of participation and civic engagement. But he, like the classical economists of the past, from Adam Smith to Karl Marx, to John Stuart Mill, despite their ideological differences, Schumpeter was working in a tradition that did not conceive economics as a value-neutral science of human behavior and social choice. He conceived economics in the classical tradition as a branch, as a subfield even, of moral and political philosophy. So that's the kind of economics I think we need if we're to begin to trust economics again.
Okay, I will move on to further questions. I'm going to take one from the floor, and then I'm going to go to Slido, since we asked people to comment to see if I can find some wonderful questions here. Please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ludovic Suran, and I'm the Chief Economist of Allianz and the YGL. You mentioned, trust and economics have a form of weird correlation. You know, causality goes in different ways, but trust and trade openness, trust and friction. So my question is, it's for Michael, but also for Christine Lagarde. Do you think that the new models that everybody is preaching these days, dirigism, interventionism, legalism, all these Cold War toolbox, do you think it will deliver better trust outcomes? Or do you think it's going to be, for a short time, we're going to be like, okay, it's going to be better, and then it's going to be really bad?
Okay, very good question. And please, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much.
Just say who you are.
Eizo Takenaka,
Yeah.
a professor of economics.
Yeah, and other things.
And former policymaker.
Indeed.
For economic policy. Based upon my own experience, well, economics is very useful for policy making. Without economics and economic evidence, economic policy is more meant to be much more poor. At that time, in that sense, what's most important is economic evidence is enough or not. Well, if it is based upon the very simple model, as you mentioned, Sandel-san, it's not useful. But currently, the economic models are not so simple, but are much more complicated and well organized. And so, economic evidence is enough or not? And another problem is, policy makers is understand this kind of economic evidence. We often use the term of evidence-based policy making. So my question is very simple. What do you think of the evidence-based policy making? Is this well done or not?
Okay, and I'm going to ask a third question, which comes from Slido. And I'm going to combine two, because they're essentially the same question. I can't deal with all of them. One said, the President Millet, you all who know who he is, I presume, has just completed his WEF speech, and he said that what we need is proper libertarianism. And that's related to the second question. Given where we are now, is it obvious that we need much more government or more market or something else altogether? So there are your three questions. And I think they are actually quite related. Let's start with Michael. Obviously, you feel that the economics we pursued in the last 40 years has been a catastrophe.
No, you didn't say that.
You're exaggerating, Martin.
Exaggerate and simplify. I'm a journalist, for God's sake. That's what we do. So the question really is, and really we have very little time, how do we change this? And is the answer, is a core part of the answer, and I think it fits with these last questions, a much expanded role for government or for some other entities within society to fix the sorts of problems you've mentioned? I hope that's not too crude a question.
No. I would say what we need and what we're experiencing really is the return of the political. Now, politics is a dangerous activity, but it's also an indispensable activity. And the scope for democratic politics was unduly constrained, even delegitimated, when we were taught and assured that the model of a frictionless, finance-driven, global, hyper-global neoliberal model would deliver benefits for everyone. The return of the political makes those questions contestable, at least. Now, in practice, is that more government or more market, I think what the return of the political to economic debate can do is to emphasize the importance of the role of government, particularly as we've seen recently, reviving antitrust legislation to deal with the economic concentration of power, especially in tech and finance. That's government, the return of the political, and also to open debates about public investment. Back to the question of whether the direction of technological innovation is fixed as if by nature. That's only if you assume it must be governed by the purposes of Silicon Valley. But if democratic citizens want to have a say in directing the future, let's say, of AI, what will make for good AI that will actually enhance life rather than simply destroy jobs, we have to have a political debate and an openness to public investment to back up the results of that debate. So what I'm calling for really is an alternative to the fixed doctrinaire, disempowering and even technocratic idea that economic models, if only we get them right, can absolve democratic citizens of the responsibility to exercise their civic agency in debating and directing the course of technology, and for that matter, the economy.
Because of time, this is a last question, and I will address it to Christine, from Professor Takanaka, who played, of course, a huge role in trying to deal with the crisis in Japan. You will all remember this, and very distinguished record. And he was talking, it seems to me very, very importantly, that part of the answer, if we're looking at it from a professional point of view, is that policy has to be properly evidence-based rather than purely theoretical. Do you agree with that strongly? And how well do you feel when you look around the world, we're getting there?
I would indeed agree with this point that policies have to be evidence-based. And this is what we have been arguing as a central bank, arguing that we have to be data dependent, that we have to be very attentive to developments. And that thing to the point that Edward was making about, don't accuse us of too much and don't expect too much of us. I'm not saying that models should be discounted completely and should be set aside and forgotten about, and that we should move exclusively to empirical data and judgment calls and discretion. I think that, number one, we should work on those models to improve them. Number two, we should appreciate and understand that they will inevitably, given the way they're constructed, they will have an element of wrong about them. Therefore, we should not assume that they will give us the answer, but they will be good in helping us reach the judgment that should be either contradicted or corroborated by data, by empirical data, by observation, by judgment, and that it's a way to probably mitigate the sort of blind faith that we had for too many years, I think, in what models could deliver. But I'm not, throwing them away. I'm saying, yes, they can be improved. Yes, they have to be supplemented. There are lots of things that you can use, sensitivity analysis, scenario analysis, and all the rest of it to improve on them. I just want to respond to what Michael was...
Briefly, because otherwise I will be
was just
shot.
concerned about his point, which is the return of politics. Because what will be the return of politics if we do not have the return of citizens?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If people don't go to the ballot box because they're uninterested and disenfranchised, what is the return of politics? I'm concerned about that.
Do we still have time for asking the two questions again? Is that permitted? Okay. And then I will conclude. I'm sorry that this is getting to the end, I think. Yes, correct? So could you put the two questions? And I would just be interested to see whether your views have radically changed. So how much do you trust our existing economic system after you've heard this erudite discussion? Oh. No, that's not a question that was permitted. Okay.
No, not quite. Look, 42, 47. No.
This is
48.
Well, I would say that
53.
Michael's made a
No.
dent in this audience, given that it's in the WEF. Yeah, so that, congratulations. It's because I wasn't allowed to debate you. Let's move to the next one. Can we do the other question? I'm sorry, I couldn't. I've answered one question from. What is the biggest problem? Yeah, still global inequalities. Environmental disasters, I think, have gone up. Or maybe not. Domestic, yeah, that's.
But we had a missing option here, and the missing option is the current economic system. Does it help or hurt the prospects of democracy and of democratic citizens?
That's perfectly true.
Next year, can we include that?
Please God, I'm not going to be doing this next year. I think this has been a very, very rich discussion. I wouldn't even dream of going into this. I'll make 2 points, and I know I shouldn't. One of them is, I think a lot of what Michael says about the past is true, but, and it's a very big but, for me, the big argument for globalization, I read a whole book about it, was on what it would do for development. And I don't think anybody can deny it had some sensational development results.
China.
And among them, incomparably the biggest decline in extreme poverty in world history. Yep. And to me, as a globalist, I think we should care about other people, global inequality. That's quite important, and I don't want to throw it away in the protectionist flood we're now getting. The other point I would make, which gets to the real methodological heart of it, is of course models must be data-based. The difficulty is data, believe it or not, come from the past.
Yeah.
The amount of data we have on the future is quite small, and it comes in the form of expectations, and they're always wrong. And that means we do need data. We need to understand these data, but they have profound and fundamental limits in telling you about what's going to happen. And I think that has come out very clearly in the debate on the inflation that we've just had, because it was out of sample. It was out of sample. And the point I make this is all these points about citizenship and all the rest of it are deep and important. I'm deeply invested in this democracy idea. But we do want to manage our society to some way, and economics is a big part of it. And the tragic problem, which is inescapable, is that it's a problem that we fundamentally cannot solve, because the economy and the decision-making in the economy is about the future. And we don't know much about the future. And if economists are clear about that, that might be very, very helpful. So it is a subject, in this respect, doomed to fail. And with that, let me conclude.